We need to stop thinking about things like memory, i.e. something that you're going to have, a noun, something you would have and keep, and go more towards a verb, which is remembering. What we want to do when we're helping people to become skillful is to enable them to have experiences and design experiences which enable them to remember. And what they remember is inhabiting a state space. And that state space involves the body, the brain, and the environment in consort.
Welcome to the Christmas edition Playtime podcast. Today's guest is Stuart Armstrong. Stuart is somebody who my daddy is known for a long time. Daddy has always admired Stuart's coach to make coaching better. In our conversation, start of ending year coaching awards, we think about what matters most in coaching. Turning up and being human is more important than getting in the perfect session. We have a great conversation from remembering and thinking. And Stuart shows practical wisdom from every level. We hope you enjoyed the podcast. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and also Happy Christmas.
Stuart, it's the end of the year, and with every end of year come awards. So let's start with the Stuart Armstrong Coaching Awards. I've got 3 awards that we're giving out today. So the first one is for the coach who's had the most impact on you.
Wow, I could go in a lot of different directions. So I'm going to go with somebody who a lot of people won't necessarily have heard of, but you will shortly. And he probably won't like me necessarily bringing him to life like this. So it's a guy called Bill McCall. And the best thing about Bill is he's been writing a book, and he's not somebody who you would necessarily think of as being a prolific author, and he doesn't particularly like the spotlight. He's involved with USA Ice Hockey and with a club in particular called the Columbus Blue Jackets. And he runs a big coaching program and development program in the community in and around Columbus. And in his book, he talks about his journey as a parent volunteer. And I'm hoping to have him on the podcast fairly soon so that you can talk about the book, because it's going to come out fairly soon. And he talks about how he coached about 4 or 5 different sports without necessarily having any of the experience of those sports himself directly. And yet the approach he took, which was largely about just turning up and being present and having a smile and being fun and being supportive and being positive, and how that predominantly is like the main thing. And the technical stuff comes later and can take care of itself. And it's a great story, really, about how, the really important things about coaching aren't necessarily the technical, tactical things that everyone thinks are important things about coaching. And actually, it's a great way of anybody who's a parent coach, which most of us are, gives them real good guidance about, you know what, actually, you might think you're not doing it very well, but you probably are by just turning up.
Really like that. I feel that feels really inspiring for coaches. Takes the pressure off in some ways. On a previous podcast I recorded last week with Jean Cote, he highlighted these 2 dimensions of coaching: the professional skills, knowing the sport, and then the interpersonal relationships, and how that's the difference between a good coach and a great coach. I wonder, and I hear you completely, the tech-tac stuff comes later. And I've talked about this loads with the guests on the podcast and coaches who I work with, that technical, tactical is important, but there's other things which are even more important. So to what degree, I don't want to downplay tech-tac too much. To what degree is technical, tactical important, and where do we strike the right balance between that and those really strong interpersonal behaviors that Bill would bring?
I would argue that the technical, tactical is, I wouldn't say that it's not important. I just think it has, maybe there's an imbalance of its levels of importance. And the reason I know this is throughout my career. For example, I used to work in the golf industry, and I would go along to conferences, or I would go along to events where there was education for coaches. And you might have, for example, a workshop that's organised that would be about communication skills or something along those lines. And hardly anyone would turn up. But the minute you got Butch Harmon, Tiger Woods' coach, to come along to give a technique based seminar, like literally, they're queuing out the door.
Yeah.
And so I think it's given too much prominence in the minds of many coaches. It's what we're interested in, isn't it? Because we're into that stuff. But what I guess I've learned over the years, I used to say this when I was coaching at National League level. I said, 70% of my job is psychological, because most of the time it was about motivation, or it was about confidence, or it was about supporting somebody through a crisis, or helping somebody deal with anxiety, anguish, pressure, all of those sorts of things. They were the real performance drivers. And I didn't have a psychologist that you could lean on. I was working in relatively high level of my sport, but you don't have those kinds of resources. So you have to be a bit of everything. And I found that the biggest drivers of performance were those things, not really the technical and tactical things, because the technical and tactical things, in my mind, they only get you so far. They're definitely important. And without them, you can't be that successful if outcomes are part of the success criteria you're using. And then the final thing I'd say, particularly when you're working at the grassroots with youngsters who are sort of, kind of taking their first steps into the game, is a bit of a cliche now, but I think it's really true, which is you can't develop a child who doesn't come back. So it doesn't matter how technically and tactically great you are, if you haven't got those other skills, those what you might call human skills, which actually bring people back to you because they really value the experience you provide for them, well, you're kind of hot, you're not really making the impact you want because the people aren't there to make the impact with. So I feel it's not necessarily it's not important. It's just I think it's given too much importance by people.
Yeah, it's maybe one of many components that we need to pay attention to as coaches, and it gets much of the limelight sometimes. Yeah, totally. It's funny, I don't know if I should say this out loud or not. I've sometimes, when I get into the depths of technical, tactical detail in football, I get a bit bored. I'd rather talk about people and all those things you just said, because that's never ending, and that's where all the development comes. The technical, tactical side of the game sometimes feels very transactional and black and white. And just circling back to Bill for a second, you said he's been a parent volunteer, and it's such a challenge, isn't it, for coaches who play that role where maybe their child is part of the team, they're coaching the team, they're also a volunteer, so the lines are blurred between them and others. Have you coached your kids through different sports? Like, how have you navigated that path that you don't want to get in the way? You just don't want to unhelpfully change the experience that they have playing sport, and you've got to think about everybody in the group. Like, what's been the things that you've thought about on that journey, and maybe what does Bill think about when he's bridging the gap?
This is why Bill's probably on my awards list, because he captured a lot of what my own reflections would be. And I think it's important, actually, because I don't think enough is written about the challenges of being a parent coach. So maybe if I tell you a quick story, and Tom, I'm not very good at quick stories, but I'll do my best. I remember I was coaching cricket. I was coaching my son cricket, and he's a pretty keen cricketer, and we played a lot in the garden and did a lot of those kinds of things. But he would probably tell you that, it wasn't necessarily he wasn't probably as able as some of the other kids in the group, but he nonetheless still had a big driver to be as good as and wanted to do that. And I remember distinctly a day where he had one of those bad days that you have in cricket. Cricket can be like that. It's quite an examination of your psychology very often, because one bad move and you're in trouble. And don't get me wrong, I've got issues with the format for, youngsters like under 11 playing. When you're out and all that stuff. But anyway, that's by the by. Nonetheless, he'd had a bad experience, he was really unhappy. He was upset. He was ashamed, humiliated, didn't want to go out and field after I'm umpiring. So I know this is happening, by the way, because I'm in the middle of the field, right? And he's over there and I can see it all going on. Anyway, the sort of break where we're going out to field, he's like saying, no, I don't want to play and I don't want to do this. And I don't want that. And I had this decision to make, which was, where does my responsibility lie? My child, who I deeply love with every fibre of my being and their well-being, or the well-being of all the other youngsters that were there to have a good time and to play a game? Where does my focus lie? I remember thinking about this is like quite a deep and profound ethical question. I hadn't really got the framework to think about. And in the end, what I decided to do was I thought, actually, my priority right here, right now, is to everybody. And my priority to him afterwards will be to him. I don't know how that's worked out necessarily, and so what I decided to do is I actually decided to go down this more of a, say, tough love scenario. And I gave him this question, which question was, right, you have a choice now that you'll remember this day going forward, and you have a choice. And the choice is, you can either, I didn't use this word, but if words to this effect, you could get off your pity pot, if you like. You can either dig deep, pull the tears back, go out and field, go out and play your part, go out and be a teammate, think about the other people out there, or you can sit here and wallow in your own self-pity. And obviously that will have its own consequences later on. And he, to his credit, he went to the field, he took a couple of good catches, and all of a sudden everything was forgotten and he was fine, right? But nonetheless, we still had a conversation about it afterwards. And I talked to him about, and he was all full of self-doubt and self-criticism and all this sort of stuff. And I said to him, look, you can either use this experience as a validation that you don't think you're going to be good enough and this, that, and the other, or you can use it as fuel. And you can practice more, and you can work more, and you can improve more, and you can make sure that a day like today doesn't happen again, or you minimize the chances of it happening again. And that became, I guess, a bit of a sort of definitive life moment, right? I was fortunate, I think, that I had some tools at my disposal by virtue of the people that I'd rubbed shoulders with and how to deal with these kinds of challenges and things like that, where I was able to navigate that a little bit. But I wonder sometimes if I hadn't had that, like if I was, say, somebody who was maybe sort of more in the early stages of my career, what would have happened and where would I have placed my attention and what would my focus have been? So what I think is it's a uniquely challenging experience that is often overlooked how difficult it is. And that's not just the parental dynamics. I mean, coaching young people full stop is a really challenging thing, particularly when you're volunteering, particularly when you've got duty of care and all these sorts of challenges. I think it's a really overlooked thing. But nonetheless, I think once you add the emotional dynamics of the parenting side of things and where your care needs to be placed and your emotional well-being and all those sorts of things, I think you start to add in some additional layers. Really interesting. Don't know if that helps, but yeah.
No, it does. I mean, there's lots to think about, isn't there? And I'm considering it now with Charlie, who's 5 and just getting into football and balancing out. I want to give him brilliant experiences, but I don't want to get in the way of his development, and I want it to be the most positive one possible. On another episode, we had a chap called Paul Bowden, who I idolise slightly because he's an ex-Swindon Town player, but he coached his son, Billy, who's now a professional, and he said very similar in a way that be fair to everybody, and he recognised that he was probably a little bit tougher on his son than others at the time. Wasn't saying that was right or wrong. He was just acknowledging that was the reality of it. But what you said there about being able to frame it with your kids, to better talk about this is a bit different to maybe some of the other kids' experiences there. It is complex and it is an ethical challenge. Mm-hmm. Right. Second award. So we've had our coach who had the most impact on you in 2025. The next award is, what's the environment you've loved being part of the most award?
Because I'm in coach development now quite a bit more than I'm in, say, in and around the coaching space. I'm thinking more about the kinds of environments that people are creating to help others learn. And I think one of the environments that probably comes to mind is, again, I'm going back to USA ice hockey again. So I do a lot of work with the ice hockey community, and I've been privileged to spend 2 full weekends where they brought together all of their coach education, coach development workforce to take them on a developmental journey. And I've had the privilege to be part of that learning journey and the experiences. And one of the things I've observed is expert adult learning facilitators at work, some of whom are doing it voluntarily because they're just so committed to helping other people learn. But, the intentionality through which the learning experience is curated, the thought that's given to the way that the activities are curated and the way discussion is facilitated and the way interaction is curated, where, say, more experienced practitioners get the opportunity to sit with less experienced practitioners to advise, guide, learn from each other, and the intentionality that goes into that. So many great examples of how that was delivered and how that was done. But one of my favorites that comes to mind as well was where one of the facilitators curated an activity where a group of people had to beat ChatGPT in a debate. So ChatGPT had previously been kind of programmed with a certain set of characteristics, and which are likely the sort of characteristics that somebody might experience. And with a group, we had to try and beat it at all the pushback it was likely to give us for a particular thing that we were going to work towards. It was really good fun, actually.
To try that. What a great idea to take into next year. You used the word curating the experience, not delivering it or delivering content. Why did you use the word curating?
So if you think about when you use the word curate, you often think of a museum. You have a curator of a museum, don't you? And what does a museum tend to think about? Well, what a museum does is it takes you on a bit of a journey where I guess you can follow your own interest to a certain extent, but they're quite intentional about the way the museum is designed so that you are learning in a way that is going to give you a meaningful experience when you go there. And I think that's what that word evokes in me, and that's what this learning experience definitely was. It wasn't, this is what you're getting, within the boundaries of the limitations of time and the fact that, you're getting there, people there for a relatively short period of time, but everything was designed with a learning intention in mind, even down to the social activities, which were designed not necessarily because they were going to facilitate learning necessarily, but because they knew that was an important component of how learning would take place and how it would be facilitated. And so that was the social side of things, and the connections that were created was actually an intentional outcome of the activity. Therefore, those social experiences were designed in such a way to foster social connection. Curated, designed, I suppose, is another way of looking at it. But yeah, I like to think of it, it's more of because when you design or you deliver, it's kind of almost a bit forced. And that's definitely not what this is. This is much more about the creation of an experience, the curation of an experience that people are able to then go through almost in their own way a little, but with some guidance.
Yeah, okay. The name that comes to mind when you were telling that story is Andrew Gillett, who I know you know, and I know AG's been a guest on your podcast. I was on a learning experience with AG not too long ago up at Leeds Beckett University. And the reason he comes to mind is, the first time I met AG, he took a group of us around the Tate Art Gallery in Liverpool as a way of being a stimulus for conversation, looking at art. But he said something to me or to the group that has stuck with me so much. So when you look at a new idea, maybe it's something a coach is doing when they're doing their work, or maybe you've seen a new framework or some research, rather than asking the question, what do you think? Which could be quite a reductive way of looking at anything. In the same way of looking at a piece of modern art in an art gallery, what do you think? He shifted the language to, what do you make of this? With the intent of saying, well, from the stimulus of the art or from the stimulus of the coach leading their practice, you and that piece of work or that coach could generate something new. You could make something with it, which neither of you would have got to completely on your own. Which for me, just that simple idea has shifted so many of my ideas around practice supporting coaches. What do you think to what do you make of this? And from your experience with ice hockey, it doesn't feel like anybody was telling you what to do. It was the environment was created in a way that it encouraged you to make new things of those interactions.
That's exactly how I would describe it. Yeah. And I guess if there probably was that question was implied there. I don't think it was explicitly ever said. It was implied. What do you make of this? Yeah, and it was one of my reflections because I was there partly in a facilitation capacity, but partly in an observational capacity to be able to provide feedback as to how things could evolve and improve. And I came away with that sort of question in my mind that it's what people make of it that's the big thing. And it's actually something they ought to probably be better at trying to capture in a follow-up conversation individually.
Final award. I challenge you not to mention USA Ice Hockey again.
I'm going to not mention USA Ice Hockey.
What is your learning experience that stayed with you of the year award?
So there's been a number. I guess the one that's stayed with me the most might not be that positive. Sometimes the negative things can be quite positive, can't they?
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of my learning experiences that stayed with me is having a difficult experience with a group of young players that I'm providing coaching to. Well, it's a bit of both, actually. So I'm mentoring a couple of young coaches who are leading activity for the first time under my supervision, not always with me there, but it is always under my supervision. And we discuss what they're going to do with the group. And there's a challenging group that have really quite different motivations. And one of the things that we attempted together was to provide choice. And this is very much, kind of driven by Play Their Way and the idea of children's rights and voice choice journey. And so what we look to do is we look to solicit their viewpoint around the experience they wanted and offer choice as to the experience so that you don't just come along and everyone's doing the same thing. And therefore, they would have some degree of agency over the journey that they were on. And the choice we gave was that there's one group, which is the group that's come to look to improve, look to put in the energy and the effort and to focus and to come at it with that kind of a mindset. And the other group was what we referred to as the sort of more social group, where there's still going to be some activity. We're still going to be, being participatory and respectful and all those sorts of things, but it's got less of a improvement focus and more of a just connection and experience and all that sort of stuff. And it was really interesting that almost like a cohort all went en masse towards the social group. Another cohort went, and they are friendly outside of the club environment, and they go to the same school and all those sorts of things. And that in and of itself presented some challenges because of the ways in which they split themselves up and then the attitude they brought to that. So it was almost like the social group, once given the choice, felt like, oh, well, bets are off. We can just pretty much mess around. And then the young coach leading that activity found that difficult because they were almost bordering on being disrespectful. And he had to remind them a couple of occasions that they need to be respectful. And also we got some negative feedback from some parents who were observing this activity going on because they didn't feel like that their children should be given the choice to doss around, if you like.
Yeah.
And so that created some additional barriers, which then the young coaches were sort of having to field a little bit. It wasn't in anything aggressive, but it was nonetheless difficult for them to sort of have to face up to. And it made me then reflect on how challenging it is, and also in many cases, how unique it is for young people to be given choice in a sporting context. And that's strange, isn't it? And when we do, and young people are given the opportunity to kind of say, I want this kind of experience, how they react to that, because often that's not an option. So it's strange for them, and therefore how they react to something that's now novel and strange is interesting to observe. And equally, the way others who are observing that perceive it, and the challenges that come with that. So, yeah, I've been reflecting on that a little bit, actually, because obviously I play a role as the chair of the club as well, not just as a coach and a coach developer, but as a chair. And I've got a different responsibility in terms of the experience provided to our membership. And I'm trying to work through a little bit and process the best way of facilitating something I believe to be really important in a way that doesn't place the coaches at risk and doesn't necessarily, but also enables the young people to come at it in the right way, if that makes sense. Yeah, so there you go.
I think you're right, though. It is challenging to offer like atypical coaching experiences. People are so conditioned to the normal template when they come and have that expectation of coach plays this role, we play that role. So anything is different, it's going to be disruptive. Do you think the young people that you were coaching will have taken anything from it, good or bad, that they will have stayed with?
I think it remains to be seen. Yeah, I mean, there's there's a sort of question, I suppose, that we need to take into the next half of the season where we begin to maybe explore the ways in which we do this differently going forward. And one of that, I think, is starting to frame a little bit around how these particular group of young people who come from different walks of life and therefore have very different motivations for being there, what they should expect from their experience and their interactions with each other and with their coaches. And then we can then play back, okay, so you therefore need us to be like this. We need to have this experience and to agree really how we're going to have those dynamics. It's not something I did in the first instance. It's something I'm actually a big believer in, but it's not something I did with this group initially because I was sort of coming in and out of it and these young coaches were leading the sessions and I wanted them to find their feet. And I also wanted to see a little bit more about what they brought already. You know, what were their strengths, what were their areas of development and all those sorts of things. Didn't want to jump on that straight away, but it's an area I now need to reflect on and improve.
Yeah. I think it's really refreshing though. And I'm so glad with the question that you've highlighted something associated with your coaching practice rather than going on a course, because learning's happening in the environments we're in all the time. But for any coach listening to this, they'll have different levels of experience and confidence and status within the club that they're working. So their window for doing things which are slightly different or will challenge the group in a different way is different. But taking that step to do something that isn't the template practice, to try something that's different and new, you have to feel really quite brave to do that. It's quite a courageous act for a coach to be able to do it. And I think from your perspective, from my perspective, maybe with a bucket load of experience behind us, you maybe feel more confident to try these things which are atypical. But for coaches who are earlier in their journey, that can come with, you said the word risk yourself, risk for the players, but risk for the coach too.
The interesting thing about the young coaches that I'm working with, though, I think, was they were really open to it. And I think, interestingly, it's probably more challenging for me because I'm used to a particular model. And to them, actually, that seemed quite normal, quite a positive, co-creative approach. Even though it placed them in some difficulty, they were very embracing of the idea of it and wanted to give it a go. So in many respects, that was the positive side of that. We just now need to work on the ways in which we frame it, I think.
Yeah. No, totally. Okay, Stuart, thank you for the awards. So we've had the coach who's had the most impact, the environment you've loved being part of, and the learning experience that stayed with you. When we do these awards 12 months from now, what award maybe should we include for coaches?
I'd like to see an award for coach developers, because I think coach developers are misunderstood, vital, really important. And when I say coach developer, I don't necessarily mean somebody with like a role and the jumper that says coach developer on it. I mean anybody who's provided some support and guidance to somebody who is in their practice and is given them support. And that could be courses, coach education, or seminars or webinars or podcasts, or it could be somebody next to you, somebody with you, a peer support, or it could be somebody with a more definitive role who is there to give you the support, whether it's in situ, remotely, whatever it might be. I'd love to see coaches recognizing all of the people around them who give them support.
Stuart, we'll segue into the second part of our conversation. And as regular listeners to the podcast will know, we ask every guest to add something to our growing game plan, this shared playbook of ideas and stories that our guests then offer to coaches to be able to think about based on your own experiences. So for today, Stuart, what would you like to add to our game plan?
I'm going to throw in something that I've only really just been learning about. So part of around my podcast, there's also a learning community called the Guild of Ecological Explorers. Those who haven't stumbled across my podcast yet will know that it's about all things human development, which obviously is about coaching. But it's also specifically, I think, begun to become more and more focused around a particular branch of psychology, ecological psychology, which I think has a lot of interesting avenues to follow and has some different explanations about how humans learn, particularly in the physical activity space or the physical space. And I think there is a lot to be learned and drawn from that space. And I've been on a real learning journey as far as that's concerned. But most recently, we do something each year called the Christmas Lecture, where that group comes together and a learned individual will lead a Christmas lecture. And it's not really a lecture, but it's kind of a lecture because it's about a particular topic or something of interest. And one this year was led by Andrew Wilson from Leeds Beckett University, who's a prolific writer and thinker around all aspects of ecological psychology. And he's really interested in its exploration within sport and has done quite a lot of writing in that space. He writes a really good blog to try and bring to life some of the quite dense research as far as this is concerned. And this lecture really brought it to life again because it was on another level. And the lecture will sound like it's not even sort of semi-relevant really, which was around memory. And why I'm interested in this is because particularly people use this term muscle memory, right? Which is a strange term, right? Because muscles don't have brains. But it's this idea that if you repeat a movement enough, it develops a movement memory. So there's a representation that you can create, which means that you can then ground this technique and you can become better at it. And it's a fairly extensive, that term is, if I was to say that to people, they would just nod sagely.
Yeah, know what you're talking about, yeah.
Turns out it's a myth, or at least it's not quite how we think about it. And also memory in and of itself, which is this idea that if I provide somebody with an experience of something, if they do it enough, it will almost become encoded. So there's this process of encoding and storage and then retrieval. And the idea is that you experience something, you encode it, you then store it somewhere, and then when you need it, you retrieve it. And people often think of motor programs in movement as being like that. So, if I do something enough, I can store it, and when I need it, I'll need it. And so that's why lots of people do unopposed practice activities and all those kinds of things, because they think it's about doing the repetitive movements in order to store them away and use them later on. Well, the ecological approach rejects that notion altogether and suggests actually that you're not trying to encode things. You're not trying to put stuff into the back of your memory to be retrieve it back, motor programs to be stored away and pulled out when you need them. What you're actually trying to do is you're actually trying to experience what he referred to as a state space. And the way the ecological practitioner thinks about this is we never really think of the body or the brain or the environment in isolation of themselves. And this is what we tend to do. So people tend to think about, right, I'm going to work on something that's going to help me think about something. I'm going to do some decision-making practices or I'm going to do some, if it's body related, I'm going to do some technique stuff. Or I'm going to put you in a game now, and then you're going to be in an environment. And the idea being is you sort of deconstruct them all in a session, and then you sort of reassemble them in some scenario. Well, an ecological practitioner thinks very differently about it and says, actually, we're always thinking about the brain, the body, and the environment in congruence all the time, and all aspects of this must be the case. And so what he says was, we need to stop thinking about things like memory, i.e. something that you're going to have, a noun, something you would have and keep, and go more towards a verb, which is remembering. And what he suggested in this lecture, which I'm really interested in and want to explore more, was that what we want to do when we're helping people to become skillful is to enable them to have experiences and design experiences which enable them to remember. And what they remember is inhabiting a state space. And that state space involves the body, the brain, and the environment in consort. And so where I came at this and the thinking I had from that was this idea of you're trying to build familiarity. So if you think about whenever you've traveled somewhere, nowadays, if you use a sat-nav and you were to try and then go back to that place, you would still need to use the sat-nav to get there. When I didn't have a sat-nav, or if I haven't had a sat-nav and I've had to navigate myself somewhere, I can almost always get back to that place if I had to go there again. Why? Because I was familiar with it. Why? Because I paid attention to the things around me. I paid attention to landmarks and various other things like that. So I was absorbing the information by being in the state space, and the state space was I needed to attend to the relevant variables in that environment for me to learn how I was going to get where I needed to get to. Now, I think quite a lot of coaching is the equivalent of being a sat-nav. The instructions are given, the guidance is given live as you're acting, because it's in the form of instructions. The outcomes are predetermined, not exploratory. And as a result of that, people never getting the opportunity necessarily to find their own way towards some sort of learning outcome or movement outcome. They're predefined, predisposed, and it's about really you just as a sort of almost passive recipient going along that journey. By thinking about this in a slightly different way, how do we create a landscape or a state space where we're able to gain familiarity over a period of time, and we can deepen the familiarity without necessarily being predetermined about where we go, so that people are continuously forced to attend to the information around them so they become more aware of this idea. People would often refer to this as pattern recognition. This is a slightly different way of conceiving of pattern recognition. People think of pattern recognition as I need to see these patterns and they're going to encode them. No, we're not encoding them. We're just being familiar with them. And so it's about this continuous process of familiarity. In order to be in that environment, you have to become really familiar with it. And this is often how, for example, mountain rescue people work. So they will sense a change in weather way before any of the data parameters necessarily would give them that information, or even before their visual cues would necessarily see it. They'll sense it, they'll feel it. They call it like a sixth sense. It's not actually a sixth sense. It's 21 different senses working in action together. But it's because they've been in the state space so much, where they learn to become attuned to the variables that are likely to occur in order to help them make decisions and navigate. Sorry, that was a long-winded explanation, but that's an area that I'm really fascinated in.
Wow. I don't really want to add anything to it, because what a brilliant provocation for coaches to go and reflect on for themselves and to think about, and how fascinating is that contrast between memory moving towards remembering. And in the context of coaching, that will ultimately change the way we design practices and the way the coach behaves and the experience that the players have, because we're trying to get there in a totally different way.
It's one of the things I like about this learning community that I have, which is, although I'm the sort of facilitator and the curator, and I create the state space, I actively learn within it, from the questions that are posed or the ideas that are shared, or sometimes we get this external, stimulus coming in that then sends us off on all these different rabbit holes. But nonetheless, it's a great place to be if you're curious about stuff.
If people have heard this and they're interested and you've sparked their curiosity with what you've just shared, where could they go to find out more?
Reach out to me directly. I'm on LinkedIn a lot, so DM me on LinkedIn. Or the other way is to go to thetalent.equation.co.uk. And there's actually a little button on the top right-hand side, I think, or it might be the left, right-hand side, of the screen, which says join the learning community. And you'll get invited in that way and join in. It's quite informal, but we've got coaches from all over the world in all different sports. So, yeah.
Stuart, final part of our conversation, our game-changing advice, because I've always really wanted this podcast to feel quite tangible and applicable for the coaches who are listening, with something that they can take away. And as I frame this in every episode, the advice that I'd love you to give is something that coaches can pick up and apply in their own environment. They might edit it depending on the context and what they're going after, or it might just be something that they reflect on and park for now, but come to at another time. So from all your oceans of experience and time coaching and supporting coaches and leading system change, what's your game-changing advice?
So I saw something this morning, actually. It was all about Marcelo Bielsa, who I followed for a long time and quite an admirer of. Certain aspects of the way he operates that maybe not as positive necessarily, but there's a certain, what's the word? There's almost there's some conflicts, actually, in some of the things that he does that are interesting. But one of the things he talked about was he saw footballers, in this case, as he saw there was certain footballers who were geniuses, like the Pelés and Maradonas and Messis and these sorts. But they were very few and far between. And the vast majority of footballers could never be them, but they could imitate them. So he had this idea that he was going to put in place an environment where he would give people the best opportunity to imitate their genius. Now, I actually think that's poor language, and it might actually be part of translation. I prefer to think of it in a slightly different way, which is how do we create an environment for them where people can become the best versions of themselves that therefore means that they can self-actualize they may not have the gifts of others, but if they take their own gifts and maximize them, what can they do? And if you take Bielsa's time at Leeds United, where he sort of got them from languishing in the second division down up to the Premier League and then being a competitive force in the Premier League, really quite shocking, quite a lot of teams. What that was a story of was taking players who weren't necessarily superstars and helping them collectively and individually self-actualize and maximize their gifts or maximize their capabilities. He did it in some strange ways, but one of the ways he did it, and this is the takeaway for everybody. So firstly, it was this idea of the goal is to help people imitate greatness. His language, not my language, but you see what I'm trying to say. But the way he did that was interesting. And he said that sometimes people would just play a lot of five-a-sides and this, that, and the other. He never did that with this group, right? And this is where this whole idea of the game being the teacher is a misnomer. And I think some coaches have gone down that road of, we're just going to play games because the game will be the teacher. Mm-hmm. You have to be more intentional than that, way more intentional than that. And this is where things like the constraints-led approach give us an approach. What he did was he broke down the game through hours and hours and hours and hours of video footage into particular moments and particular actions that people might take that would give them an advantage in a scenario. And then he designed what he called exercises. Now, his were unopposed. Mine would be more opposed because I'd want to maintain fidelity with the environment as much as possible. But he would design exercises where people could spend time familiarizing themselves, remember that word, with these scenarios so that when they appeared in the game, there was a way for them to navigate through those scenarios. And so the takeaway here for coaches is think through those moments. Think through those key things in the game, take a slice of the game out and design practice environments that enable people to familiarize themselves with those slices before you then place them back into the game. But be intentional about it and think about how you can maintain as much of the elements of the game as you can within the boundaries of numbers and time and space and all those sorts of things.
What a brilliant step-by-step process you've just taken us through. And I think there's a really important point to highlight and emphasize there. It's familiarization with a slice of the cake, as you've put it, rather than perhaps reductionism of certain specific skills or techniques within a game, and then creating the environment that people become attuned to those experiences and then they can recognize them for themselves when it really matters.
Bingo.
Stuart, thank you. I was a guest on your podcast about a year ago, and it's lovely to be able to invite you into this conversation. 3 key headlines that stand out for me from some of the things we've explored together. I wrote this down. It doesn't sound like me at all. From what you just shared, collective self-actualization perhaps is what came to life in the Bielsa story, but maybe it's helping players become the best version of themselves and then the plan on how to get there. Moving from memory to remembering. And I'm really fascinated about that. I'm definitely going to ask you more about it at another time. And how much prominence might we give technical and tactical skills when we're thinking about all the other things that coaches need to do and consider and the relationships they need to hold within the work that they do. Stuart, thank you. Been a fantastic guest, and I look forward to catching up again with you soon.
Cheers, Tom.
Thanks for listening to the Game Plan Coaching Podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please follow the show and share it with a coach who might find it useful. I'd love to hear your feedback and any ideas you have for future guests. You can get in touch through the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and go well in your next coaching session.